Welcome to the Enterprise Excellence Podcast, where our purpose is to help create a better future. Learn from our world's experts how to improve your organisation sustainably. Learn how to achieve and sustain an excellence journey for yourself, others, and the planet.
And I'm your host, Brad Jevons, coming to you from Brisbane, Australia. We are proudly brought to you in association with SA Partners, a world-leading business transformation consultancy. SA Partners are a truly purposeful company focused on helping organisations achieve sustainable improvement for themselves, others, and the planet.
Welcome to episode 58 of the Enterprise Excellence Podcast. It is such a pleasure to have Mr. Bruce Hamilton on the show with us today. Bruce has created some of the most engaging, knowledge-transferring content I have ever come across in Lean, one of those being Toast Kaizen. Bruce is an author and educator who has helped some of America's largest and smallest organisations on their road to world-class practices. Let's get into the episode. Bruce, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Brad.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Bruce, what's your backstory? Like, what significant moments and paths took you down this journey that you've been on, becoming such an influencer in lean and continuous improvement and excellence within organizations?
Yeah, so it's just continuing. This is one of these things that every day is a new day, and the past 18 months have definitely been in that category. New challenges, new discoveries. But my interest, I guess by nature, I like solving problems. So I didn't ever plan on getting into manufacturing. I have a degree in English literature, which actually has fared me pretty well because there's a lot you can learn about people from English literature. But I started out in a marketing department and had fun with that. Then ended up taking an interest in what we call data processing back in the 1970s, and got into IT and did that for 7 or 8 years. Went back to school and really loved that. Great, lots of problem solving, but mostly technical problems. And that led me into, a factory because somebody had to be using this software. And, so this was an epiphany. They weren't using it very well. It wasn't doing much for them. It was a MRP kind of network scheduling. Seemed like we had lots of inventory, but never had the right inventory. And, I was located in a building that was 2 blocks away. So I didn't have a lot of experience with manufacturing. And it was pretty grim. When I first visited, there were people really slaving to try to do things in spite of the systems, not just the IT, but everything else that was going on. It was somewhat of it was not a total surprise to me because my father was a machinist, and I got the feeling that he was not loving what he was doing. He was a long-suffering man, really wonderful, brilliant guy. And that's probably why I went into marketing. I figured I'm going to try something different than that. So anyway, I end up by happenstance in manufacturing, have a need. And it was my good fortune. I've been very lucky that at the particular time, fast forward to maybe 1985, there was a publisher that was just getting started in Cambridge, Massachusetts, just a short distance from my plant, called Productivity Press. There was this very unusual dude named Norman Bodek. And we were just a couple miles away, and Norman took a liking to us. He brought Norman. That's a whole other story. Norman is an incredible guy, kind of eccentric, Brooklyn guy on the one hand, but on the other hand, just sort of very, very mindful sort of person. And he brought this whole library of productivity to the West. It was incredible what he did. And I just happened to be there at the start of that. And he took a liking to us. So we had the good fortune of having visits from a lot of very famous Japanese consultants. In the 1980s, nobody wanted to see him. We were the only show in town. And I would like to say that was because of, great insight on my part, but it was pretty much dumb luck. We had a problem. We started out reading the only books that we could find on continuous improvement. And one of them had a footnote in it to Shigeo Shingo, then to the 7 Wastes, and that led us to Norman. And then Norman got us started. And, Norman also founded the Shingo Prize. So that was, that was a big deal too. That sort of headed us in that direction. But so I discovered, TPS, lean, continuous improvement out of need. The factory that I inherited was struggling. Our deliveries were not very good. Our costs were an issue. Morale was poor. And here was this means, and I was a novice. It was my good fortune that I didn't know any better, because I probably would not. There's so much unlearning that's part of, what we now call lean. I didn't suffer from that because I didn't have that experience. So that's very good luck on my part.
Bruce, you're talking about Norman Bowditch and the connection there with that, the publisher. How did you get connected in there to a publisher when you were working in a manufacturing facility?
Norman Bowditch is a whole other story. He's a very important person in my life. He was not a manufacturing guy. He knew relatively little about manufacturing. He was somebody who was publishing transcendental meditation books in Cambridge, Massachusetts. That was what Norman did. And before that, he was head of a data processing management association. He was quite the entrepreneur. I don't know how much he knew about data processing either, but he was an accountant, so possibly he did. And he spent some time down in Barbados setting up banks of people to enter key telephone numbers into telephone books. So Norman was kind of at the forefront of all kinds of stuff. And then he moved on and did other stuff. So by the time I'd seen him, he had a little upstairs build business. And on one side of the aisle was Productivity Press, this fledgling company that was publishing a couple of books. And across the aisle was Rudra Press, which was publishing books on transcendental meditation. Wow. Very interesting man. But anyway, I came in contact with Norman Bowditch because when I got into found myself in manufacturing without a lot of background, I started to read. And an early book that's still, I think, a valuable book is one called Zero Inventories. And it was kind of a reporter's book. It was somebody on the outside looking in. And somewhere right at the front of the book, there was a footnote to Shingo and Seven Wastes. That led me to Productivity Press because Norman was publishing Shingo's books. And there are some just wonderful books. I got every one of those books. I just told Norman, whenever you publish a book, just send us one. We'll pay for it. So I don't know that I read them all, but I read a lot of them. And pretty much they were all Japanese authors at the start. There were a few others later, some of which, have just not ever come to light. They've gone out of print and they were wonderful books. So it's like this treasure trove of stuff still to be discovered. But that was very helpful to me. And certainly Shingo was a huge benefit to an organization that was struggling. For us, it wasn't academic. We were, our on-time delivery was terrible. Our inventory turns were terrible. And Shingo had some answers to these things, the technical stuff. But he also, if you read his writing, it's all about people, So he's this technical guy who really loved to dig into problems. There's so much about human nature, and that was very valuable as well. In 1989, Shingo visited our plant, and I bragged that it was the last U.S. plant he visited, only because he passed shortly thereafter. He probably would have gone elsewhere. Yeah. But it was a memorable visit as well, very memorable. And he even wrote about it in his last book, because for him, you can imagine, he was in a wheelchair, and he was, so he came in the employee's entrance because of stairs and so forth. There was no way to get in. At that time, we had an employee's entrance, and so an announcement came over the PA that anybody would like to greet Mr. Shingo on his way in, they would be welcome to go and line up in the corridor. The place emptied. 400 employees emptied into this corridor and applauded for him. That was, totally unscripted. And I clearly had an impact on Shingo because he wrote about it. I think he felt underappreciated. And his handler at the time, Derek Kotze, leaned over to me and he says, he's never had an experience like this in his life. So I feel like, hey, we gave something back. To the dude who brought, TPS out to the rest of the world. So that very big influence for me. Yeah.
That's massive. And I didn't realize too that Productivity Press and Routledge were that connected in with those early authors. Like I got my book published by Routledge Productivity Press also. I didn't realize that history.
Well, this is a long time ago, Brad. Productivity Press was split off, and that's a story. I won't go into the details on that, but Norman went through some changes in his life, and some of the business went one place and some of it went another place. And he left Productivity Press. So Productivity Press lives on and publishes some great books. But at the time Norman was publishing, it was just one Japanese author after another. And he had the knack to find these folks. He found, like, his first book, which was one of his great books that doesn't get much attention, is a book called Managerial Engineering by Ryuji Fukuda. Dr. Fukuda is still alive. He's a Deming Prize winner, and he's a brilliant guy by himself. So as I understand it, this is how Norman got into publishing these books, because Norman and Ryuji Fukuda had the same Swami, and they met at an ashram. And this is Norman's mind, all of a sudden, new idea, and turned out to be a really great idea.
Yeah, I know. And what did he do?
It's quite an interesting story. Norman wrote a book about his own life, and I don't know how much of it is in there, but I'm sure there's a bunch of other people who could write about it as well. So very, very important guy.
And like the influence on yourself, but also, Bruce, as we know, on manufacturing all over the world based on that publishing coming out and other content coming out.
Yeah.
Because there was a lot to learn, wasn't there? There was a lot to learn.
A lot to unlearn.
Yeah, a lot to unlearn.
That was the problem. For me, it was easier because I'd never spent any time in operations. So it was just all new. Like, this must be the way it is. But I know certainly as a consultant now, it's a struggle. We're so programmed in our frameworks for measuring and determining what good looks like are just distorted. And so it's conceptually, it's very difficult for managers in particular, because, for production people, for folks who are on the floor, it's easier because, first of all, they're familiar with things that aren't working very well. And secondly, because they're there, they have that direct observation. I'm sure you've had this experience too. Every time you walk into a workplace and you see what's actually going on, it's like, oh, wow, look at this. But this isn't supposed to happen. And this happens every day. So I think, but for managers, typically, in fact, it wasn't even appropriate for managers to be out on the floor. People, maybe even in my own organization, would say, that's not our job. We have jobs. That's, we got people on the floor for that. And so you don't get close enough to actually discover why these concepts make sense. Yeah.
Oh, Bruce, I've seen it all the time. And I've even been that side myself, where I've been sitting up in an office and thinking what the problem is, and this has got to happen. And then I go down and I talk to people and see on the floor, and I go, oh, I was just being totally off course there.
Yeah.
Like, I've had egg on my face, I got to admit.
Yeah. It's humbling.
Very humbling. Yeah. But it's also reinforcing. I think it's half the battle is just understanding and knowing, because I guess if you didn't know some of these things that Bowditch helped to start to spread and get word out there, and then you've lived on that legacy and helped so much and others, you wouldn't have that epiphany necessarily. You'd go down and maybe still think your same path of, we got to do this project, or there's this thing we got to do.
That's true. That's true. It's easy to take a look at something and not see anything. I've had that experience too.
Yeah.
Kind of missed the whole picture.
Yeah. And Bruce, what led you to do things like create Toast Kaizen and all this other great content that you've done? I can understand why it's so good, because the thing that baffled me is, how can someone from a pure lean engineering manufacturing background cut such an entertaining professional video in a very funny way? And I understand, because of your marketing background and some of the other things you've done in your career now. But what led you to that?
So there's a story, definitely a story about that as well. It's really not a professional video. We did it on the first take. But I will say it's the third time I'd done it. So, I just became really excited about TPS, or continuous improvement. And I loved the job that I was in, but I felt like I just wanted to get out and see more companies. So through the Shingo Institute, I got out to visit really good companies, and that just got me interested in seeing other companies. So I kind of left after 28 years in one company. I left and decided I'm going to become a consultant. And but before I left, I had this wonderful opportunity to work with an organization called the Toyota Production System Support Center, an organization out of Toyota. And I know they've done some work in Australia as well. In fact, I attended a presentation by Toyota Australia. I think maybe that Toyota Australia has maybe moved on, but at the time I had this opportunity to learn from folks at Toyota, and it was totally different. It was like, and after 10 years of trying to understand, and at this point we were a Shingo Prize recipient. So we weren't overly proud of what we did, but we were along the journey a little bit. We were doing things. And so that attracted a gentleman by the name of Mr. Hajime Oba, who probably is the greatest influence on my work. It just changed the trajectory for me, because Jost Oba had a way of asking questions to direct your observation. It's kind of embarrassing, like by the time he finished asking questions, you're sort of feeling stupid. And he was a tough guy, but so he came in and said, you select a project and we will help you with that. So he helped me to understand what I consider to be a better way to approach TPS, like inch wide, mile deep. Don't try to spread it everywhere. That doesn't work. That was very helpful. But the whole philosophy behind, not the technical part. Technical part was something we were starting to get fairly decent at, but the philosophy was something that was really, really powerful. And like something as simple as direct observation, making sure that, you really really are watching. And I could tell, a day's worth of stories about Mr. Oba and direct observation. But anyway, at one point, after working with us for several years, Mr. Oba said to me, his English was marginal. Okay, he says, management must do Kaizen too. Okay, so if you can imagine, this is going to sound kind of hackney-ish, but it was a little bit like Mr. Miyagi and whatever that kid's name was, Daniel. I was about young enough to be Daniel at the time, and I said, well, of course, Mr. Oba, I'm supporting all the time, always doing. I'm helping people. He said, no. He says, you, Bruce, you must do Kaizen personally. And so, as often the case, I wasn't sure why, but I didn't ever argue with Mr. Oba, because I took it on faith that he knew, because he was just that smart, that brilliant. So I said, yeah, okay. And so I spent the next 6 weeks and I picked some projects that were things that I felt I could contribute. And they were all kind of on the factory floor. And the folks on the shop floor, they were very helpful. I think they kind of laughed with me as I was struggling. And I learned along the way that, it's not that easy. It's kind of humiliating. So there were some good things that I learned. And Oba comes back, and I think it was about 6 weeks later, and I showed him what I'd done and said, yeah, you've done a pretty good job. He says, now all management must do Kaizen. Now, I was the general manager at the time, but not every one of my reports was buying it. They were supportive, but the idea of personally doing Kaizen, that wasn't going to fly. Not for all of them. A couple of them said, we'll do it. So I had, in a moment of desperation, I literally, sort of that time in the middle of the night when you wake up because you're just thinking so hard and you can't come up with a solution. Because this is how it was. If I showed a commitment to it, TSSC would continue to work with us. That was the deal. If I didn't show a commitment, they would wish us well and be on their way. And I didn't want that to happen. Yeah. So in a moment of, just utter frustration, I came up with this idea that maybe I could get every one of our executives to practice direct observation and continuous improvement by going to a process where they wouldn't feel threatened or self-conscious. And that was making a slice of toast. So that's where it came from.
Nice.
Came out of that. It was originally for an executive team, and everybody did it. And I worked for a privately held company, and the owner of the company did a wonderful standardized work diagram and showed, all of the steps that he'd taken. It was really quite good. I wish that I'd saved it, but I didn't. And everybody else did something. And out of that, I got maybe 50, 60% take up. But yeah, okay, we see this now. We actually, nobody's ever looked at us making a slice of toast before. And so direct observation, that makes a lot of sense. And we see where the waste is. And then when I went into consulting, I made that video because I used that video. And then I made another one that was a little neater because, having your son crying in a video doesn't work well at customers. And then finally, somebody in my office said, maybe if you polish this up a little bit, make it a little longer so we can sell it. Well, ironically, we probably shouldn't have made it longer. Today, nobody wants to see anything over 8 minutes long.
No.
But so that's the whole brutal story of Toast Kaizen. And so that video was made in 2004, but the original intent was to convince a leadership team that they needed to be more involved in continuous improvement.
Go to enterpriseexcellencepodcast.com/downloads to download an Enterprise Excellence Big Picture Map, which will allow you to analyze your organization's systems in line with your longer-term vision, meaningful goals, culture, and customers. Please like, subscribe, and share this podcast to help others gain insights and create a better future. Let's get back into the episode. I love that story, Bruce, because there's two parts to it. One, I got to admit, in Australia and myself and everything that I've been spoken to, Toast Kaizen's been very much largely used as a middle management frontline education tool.
Yeah.
And then that conversation about OBA and the need to engage the executive and for them to run continuous improvement or Kaizen, and what you did with Toast Kaizen to help create that. Like, Bruce, why have you discovered that is important? What OBA said, that the management executive get involved in continuous improvement.
Yeah, well, not only Mr. Oba. I mean, if you take a look at the great thinkers, they're all saying it. I mean, W. Edwards Deming was all over this, what management's role was. And Mr. Oba, he understood that, there are really two parts to the kind of integrated TPS model. One of them is the technical part. It's the tools. They're decent. The countermeasures, they call them. But the other is they call TPS managerial. Like, so we have quality tools, but nobody wants to admit to a problem because they're going to get punished for it. So we don't have a quality culture. We're missing that. So the TPS managerial was there so that managers could create an environment that was favorable for this stuff, so people would surface problems rather than sweeping them under the rug. And so and the status quo was, hide problems, keep your nose down, don't get involved. And where'd that come from? Well, that came from management systems too. Yeah. And so it was a matter of undoing that. And that's why the word commitment is so big. You got to let people know this is important. If a manager is not present, it doesn't mean that they're lukewarm about what you're doing. It means they're against it. That's what people immediately say. Well, Joan isn't even here. She must hate this, what we're doing. And so he said there were two things. He said, first of all, management needs to understand some level of the details. You can't have a commitment if you don't really understand some of the details. You don't need to be an expert, but you need to understand why set up a quick changeover would be important. If you don't understand that, how can you be passionate about telling people it's okay, practice the changeover, take that time, make that investment? And so he was Mr. Oba spoke in 2003. Incidentally, he passed just this past December. Very tragic. Oh, wow. Really a big loss for me. He's such a huge influence, not just on me, but many, many people. But he was asked point blank, why don't U.S. manufacturers, this is in the U.S., so probably you could fill in the blank. It doesn't really matter. You could say why Australian manufacturers, I would guess.
Yeah.
why isn't there more take up? Why haven't they gotten the full benefits of TPS? And without hesitation, he said, first of all, management does not know what TPS is. They don't understand TPS. And second of all, they're totally bound by quarterly earnings. That's all they're focused on. So between those two, that of course probably has something to do with the first answer of not understanding TPS. There's this problem that somehow or other people in management think that that's for somebody else to do. That it's so radically, the thinking is so, and concepts are so radically different. The business model, the cost accounting, the management accounting, the way businesses are organized, the physical organization, the general ledger, the chart of accounts, all messed up. When I first tried to do training, I had people on the floor coming up to me saying, Bruce, I don't know if you know this, but that training you're doing, that's considered non-productive time. And I don't think that's going to be good at my review.
Yeah.
I asked about it. They said, well, that's all we got. You're either absent or you're here or you're non-productive. And so that meant we had to go back and ask questions about why would that happen? Why would we consider learning to be non-productive? So you go through all these things, ultimately, they start to tail back to somewhere along the line. A person has to give permission to change, and that person has to understand themselves first. There was a quote in 1989 when that was the first year of the Shingo Prize and the Baldrige Prize, which are fairly major prizes. I think Shingo is maybe more major now. Was 1988, and the one recipient of the Baldrige Prize in 1988 was the Milliken Company, a large textile company, privately held. The owner was Roger Milliken, a man who, he stayed in his business till the age of 95, running his business. So it was kind of a family company. This is a company that at one point was reputed for generating 400 ideas per employee per year. I'm not sure if they're at that standard now, but it makes you wonder, well, how the heck do you even track that? How can that be possible? That's the kind of thing. That's why you have to be thinking right. If you think that can't be done, of course, you're right. So he was asked, what are the three biggest obstacles to continuous improvement? And his response was top management, middle management, and first line supervision. So this was from the standpoint of somebody who was leading the charge. He recognized that we kind of get in the way. We managers, we created these systems. They didn't just sort of natural laws. We made these things up, and we've created things which prevent people from fixing problems. So that's why Oba, I'm sure, thought this was very important.
Yeah, I'm really hearing that conversation, Bruce, too. The risk of just how you measure a team or another leader, or the system of how you look at time allocation, the system of how you consider training. It drives a culture too at the same time, doesn't it? That whole
it absolutely does. There's this structure there that frames our thinking. So and then that people say tools and culture, but tools are part of the culture. I mean, it's all one. They're all part of the same thing. They affect each other.
Yeah, and I find, Bruce, I don't know your thoughts, but I find a lot of leadership teams in organizations, they don't want to take the time to take a review of their systems in the business. Like, they're busy, they're flat out, they're highly stressed. And then when it comes to the whole concept of systems drive behavior, a lot of the times they don't want to put the time into looking at how we're measuring people. They don't want to put the time to look into the system of who's actually meeting in our business and why are we running these meetings and what do these meetings drive? And there seems to be this reluctance to actually reflect and review on all this stuff we put in place. Do you find that, Bruce?
Yeah. So, well, look, I think, management, like many other parts of the top management, is overburdened. They're overwrought. And look at how they're measured. I mean, I don't know if the statistic has changed, but at one point not too long ago, the average life of the CEO is 3 years. Yeah, so they only get so much time to make some sort of a mark. And that, given that kind of framework, and I'll just say that, if I had to pick one area where senior management, where leadership is just striking out, it's long-term thinking. Just take a look at this freaking pandemic.
Yeah.
There is no amount of tactics that can overcome a lack of a strategy. And I feel like it's almost maybe a natural flaw in human nature. We only live so long, so our framework, even though, whether it's the pandemic or whether it's the environment, all of those kinds of things, scarcity of resources, I just think we're myopic. We can only see so far.
Yeah.
And so management, the best management are the visionaries. Visionary means we're seeing over the horizon. We're looking for that because people need that leadership. And in the absence of that, we're all nearsighted. We're all just looking at carpe diem. What's going on right now? It's sort of like organizational ADD, just like work on this, work on that, and no thought about the future. And the result is, the future arrives, but it's totally out of control. And so we're just reactive. If we did nothing more than just think hard about, you're not going to be right all the time. But of course, if you're not thinking about it at all, you're never going to be right. So it's just.
What an entertaining first episode with Bruce Hamilton. Boy, he has some fantastic stories with the great lean thinkers. He has helped some of America's largest corporations and some of its smallest on the road to world-class practices. I can hear that humour plays a big part in Bruce's philosophy towards learning. We will continue to chat next week. Join us next week for the concluding episode. This 2-part episode series truly provides insights to help us all create a better future. Talk to you next week. Bye for now.